If you're a podcast host, listen up, this one's for you. My name is Allie Jackson. I'm the host of Finding Mr. Height, a dating and relationship podcast that I've been doing for 4 years now, sharing my positive and practical approach to dating that's built on my own life experience. And I wanted to share another experience that I've had, my secret behind monetizing my show. It's called Red Circle, and I was just telling my colleague about how much I love their platform. With Red Circle, not only am I getting a seamless hosting experience, but I also love the support I receive in ad sales. It's not just typical ad sales either. It's targeted opportunities based on my show and my life. And the platform is super simple. You just set your preferences and Red Circle matches you with sponsors that align with your show. You can vet every opportunity and their platform gives you great analytics. More recently too, my Red Circle team has brought me opportunities outside of my podcast on social media to really augment the podcast partnerships, bring them full circle. I just can't recommend them enough. If you want to give it a try, go to redcircle.com to get your free trial. That's redcircle.com for a free trial.
Welcome to the Get Certified Together, created as part of Technicove, a free knowledge-sharing website based in London. If you love our content, please like and subscribe from your favorite podcast player. Reach out to us via www.technicove.com for suggestions and collaborations.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Get Certified Together series. Now from this week's episode, we will be diving down into our topics and task statement around AWS Security Specialist examination. So far, we have covered AWS well-architected framework. I have shared with you few links, few articles, knowledge bases, AWS skill builder accounts-based courses which you can access free of cost, and of course you can have some good idea about what's public cloud, what AWS cloud is, and how security, networking, or basic computing looks like on the AWS infrastructure. This examination is of course specialized level examination, so we have to drill down more, and that's why I mentioned before as well, we won't be doing like what we did in the CCSP. We won't be going like one by one from the beginning, because CCSP course was actually laid out exactly what I feel it should be for AWS as well, where you start with basic. If you recall, we started with basic cloud fundamentals followed by data security, and then we start building like everything on top of that. AWS Security Specialist examination course or official study guide actually have all the topics jumbled up, and that's why I felt that we should be starting with IAM first, because IAM start with not only like identity and user but also accounting, which is really important topic. It will be covered a lot of time in the other subtopics as well, but yeah, I think that domain 4, which covers identity and access management, should be the first one which we should start as part of our AWS Security Specialist examination journey. Now, in today's episode, we will be starting task statement 4.1. After this ad break, I will be reciting you what that task statement 4.1 is, and of course we will be covering some of the topics in that task statement. So we won't be covering everything in the domain 4 in today itself, because it's a big topic. It's really good to have like a good knowledge about the AWS users and identity and access management up front, because if we miss that now, what we will be having is some sort of like resource level course and topics, and then ultimately who is accessing those resources inside AWS infrastructure plays a key role in securing the infrastructure as well. So that's why identity access management is the topic which I identify that should be our first one, and today we'll be doing task statement 4.1. So after this short ad break, I'll be back, and then we will start our first topic of AWS Security Specialist examination. Alright, welcome back. So in domain 4, identity and access management, as part of task statement 4.1, we have to understand design, implementing, and troubleshooting authentication for AWS resources. Now, keyword is authentication, because if you recall in CCSP, identity and access management actually cover two things, which is authentication and authorization. Another bit is accounting, which I think they are missing in this IAM. Probably they thought that everyone should be understanding accounting by default, but accounting is a key factor in AWS IAM as well. So as part of 4.1, what we'll start with accounting and authentication. So in their official study guide, what they want us to do is that they want us to have knowledge of methods and services for creating and managing identities. For example, federation, identity providers, AWS IAM Identity Center, which was previously known as AWS Single Sign-On, Amazon Cognito. We also should be having knowledge of long-term and temporary credentialing mechanisms. So basically you should be having some sort of like long-term service accounts, or you might have like short-term token-based credential. So we should be having knowledge of both. And of course, how to troubleshoot authentication issue, for example, by using CloudTrail, IAM Access Advisor, IAM Policy Simulator. What skills are expected from us as part of having this knowledge is we should be having idea about establishing identity through an authentication system based on requirements. We should know how to set up multi-factor authentication, and we should be skilled in use of AWS Security Token Service. Now this is for the first time they are talking about a particular service which plays a key role in creating temporary credentials. So these skills are really important as part of initial authentication. They did mention IAM Policy Simulator in the knowledge part, but policy will be covered in task statement 4.2, which is about authorization. So as part of today's episode, let's first understand basics like what's identity and access management looks like in AWS, what are users, what is principal identities, because they mention as part of this 4.1, we should be having knowledge of creating and managing identities. But what's an identity? So let's start with some of the key basic things. Now, first thing first, when you create an AWS account, you get an account. But that account is not like a simple account, that's a root account. So we have to remember the word. That account which is created for the first time is root account. Root account is kind of like a super admin account. Anything you are setting from that step onwards inside that root account will be creating further down the line. So you can create an organization inside the root account, and then further in that organization you can create further simple accounts for, if you have like different departments in your organization, then you can create accounts for different departments inside that umbrella organization. So everything will be residing in that root account. You can create, enable settings like SCP, security control policies. You can create CloudTrail logs on the all accounts from single go. You can disable even those policies and those control from that from that root account. So that's why it's really important. It's kind of like a most critical part of AWS infrastructure. If you are new to the cloud, if you are setting one up for your own testing, then what you will be getting for the first time is your root account. And if you want to further do your development work, you want to test more stuff, you want to learn more things about AWS, straight away you create another account inside that root account, and then you log in, like re-log in to your Amazon AWS console using your new credential for that subsequent account. Don't use root account for your basic testing even, because even your credit card information, your billing, everything is controlled from there. And of course you don't want to have in a situation where you have your root account with a simple password without multi-factor authentication, and then someone likes take control of that. So of course from a mature organization perspective, root account is really critical, and I think we will be covering. So what's my idea about this whole, like what's my plan of covering this task statement is we will be covering basics, and then we'll try to understand different services, how those blocks and puzzles fit together, and finally we'll be discussing about how we implement like best practices from security perspective for those services. So for example, the authentication mechanism. But yeah, as of now, you understand that root account is really critical. It should be having all the security recommendation. It shouldn't be used for your day-to-day activities. Don't think about like having root account and straight away start working on it. Just treat it as like it's the main account, which you should always keep secure. You should log in into it minimal, like you don't use it for your day-to-day operational work. So that's the idea about accounting. We will be discussing about accounting, I think, in the domain 1 as well. But as of now, from the accounting perspective, you just think that whenever you create a new AWS organization, whenever you create your new AWS account, you get a unique identification number. That's your AWS account number. And you can create further down the line more accounts, make it part of organization. Now, AWS organization in itself is a AWS service, which you can create inside your root account, and then you can further down the line, like I mentioned, you can create your accounts, you can make it part of your organization, or you kind of in tree hierarchy. So if you're familiar with Active Directory, then you remember OUs. similar kind of OUs are there in the organization as well. Now, one thing to remember is identity and access management is a concept itself, but AWS, because they were one of the like initial public cloud provider, they even created their own AWS identity and access management service. So AWS IAM is AWS service which deals with identities, users, groups, and everything. In Azure, you still have concept of IAM, but you don't have like Azure IAM service, because AWS IAM service is proprietary for the AWS side of things. So IAM as a concept is something which is applicable for anything irrespective of the cloud, but AWS IAM is a specific service which deals with users, credentials, and everything onto AWS side of things. Now, moving on to the account, once you have your account set up, of course you need some user credential as part of like entering into the account, authenticating yourself. Means that's the whole point of this subtopic which we are discussing today about the authentication. Now, for that authentication, you can create your user. You have to create a password as well, of course. AWS give you multiple options, like do you want to use this username and password for your AWS console login using GUI, or you want to use, if you are setting up like scripts and you are using SDKs, then maybe you can create access keys and you don't need the console login, so you can even control that as well as part of this username and password. So this user is your identity. And as part of authentication, we remember from CCSP as well, we have to prove that who you are. And one of the mechanisms to prove yourself that who you are is username. So AWS IAM, inside using that service, you can create usernames. Of course, that's the key and basic thing. Like for example, even when you set up your root account, you have to create a default username and password. It comes by itself. And that's like your super admin or super user password. Same concept apply here as well. Once you set up your root account, once you have your like super admin user, you don't want to give the same super admin user rights to everyone. So that will be covered in the authorization part of task statement, which is 4.2. But yeah, just for today's understanding, think that you have to create multiple users. You cannot get away with it. Now, AWS do mention that don't create username for everything. So instead of creating username or users in itself by your own like using AWS IAM service, you can also use AWS roles or AWS IAM roles, which is nothing but kind of hat which someone from minimal or basic rights can put temporarily based on the time period which we as an admin can define. Now that hat will give them or that user some additional permissions which otherwise that user is not allowed to. So that's why AWS IAM roles like symbol is also hat, because that's kind of cap which you put and you suddenly have like advanced rights as part of that cap. Or you can even compare it with badge. So normally if you are trying to enter a building, if you don't have a badge, then you might, or maybe you have a badge which you are allowed to just go to reception. Once you are in reception, you are given another badge because they trust you, so they give you another badge which give you access to maybe go into a second building. So that additional badge is kind of role that is given to you temporarily for a day, and now you have access to something which is not part of your, like which is not permitted on your basic badge which you were having initially. So that badge, that additional second badge, is kind of like a additional new role which you are getting, and you are of course getting it temporarily, because once you are done work inside the building, you are going out, you have to resubmit the badge, and your day is over, and you are back to your like normal credential or normal whatever rights you got as part of your initial primary badge. So that's the whole idea behind IAM roles. We will be going deep into how you set up IAM roles, what kind of policies looks like, and what's a trust relationship. Like if I am a user, can I assume any role? Can I be giving access to like any role which my admin have created for me? Of course, there should be some control, right? So my admin who is creating roles for me and who is creating users for me, he will decide like which user can assume what role. So that bit is again controlled by a trust relationship, and we will be going deep into that into the next week episode. But as of now, because we are covering the initial basic level of understanding, so just think from the perspective that we have identities in terms of user, and we have identities in terms of AWS IAM roles. Another type of identity is user groups. Now, user groups are nothing but group of users who should be having similar kind of permission, and there's no like hi-fi advanced use case. Only thing what you want to achieve using groups is you create that group of users, and then if there is a policy change, you simply have to change the policy on the group level, so you don't have to manage and individually update the policies for each user. So that's the whole idea behind group. I mean, it's as simple as that. So AWS IAM users and AWS IAM groups, AWS IAM roles, these are different type of identities which can be used to access a particular resource inside the application. Now, these resources can be any AWS services, and we will be covering two type of IAM policies as part of this, which is identity based IAM policies or identity IAM policies and resource based IAM policies. Both of these policies are defined like in a different way, and they have slightly different use cases. Again, because policy is part of authorization, we'll be doing that as part of 4.2 discussion. Now, another bit which we have to understand as part of this basic level discussion is the concept of principals, which is nothing but anyone who is trying to access your resource via a username or a role or an account. So that principal can be another AWS service. For example, if you have EC2 instance and your EC2 instance wants to access S3 bucket, you don't want to set up like some credential inside the EC2, some sort of like permanent credential. Instead, you can set up a trust relationship, which I mentioned, and you create a role. Don't go detail into what I'm saying, because I'll be covering it in much better way in the next week episode. But what I'm trying to say is, as part of today's discussion, in this scenario, EC2 service will be a sort of principal. So EC2 service is using that role to access S3 bucket. So EC2 service in itself will become a principal. If I'm using a particular service or I'm accessing a particular application onto the cloud, and I am trying to assume another role, so my user account, it can be a username or it can be a role, will be principal, which I'll be sending as a trusting party. So I'll be kind of like I am the party which can be trusted, and AWS IAM resources which I'm trying to access will be trusting me based on the principal I'm sending. So key concept around principal is, it is the identification, which can be your username, which can be your role, full ARN, or even a service, which is going as part of your authentication trust relationship. Now, I will cover this in better way maybe in the next week episode, but you just understand from the perspective that there is something called principal which you use actively whenever you are trying to access a service onto the cloud. Now, as part of maintaining and creating the users, AWS does recommend that don't create the users onto AWS IAM service. Reason for that is it's not scalable. It's really also creating a single point of failure as well, because you are kind of creating your user names, user access and everything from the AWS account, AWS resources. Your whole organization is controlled from there, and you are even setting the usernames there as well. So it's kind of create a single point of failure. And of course, AWS recommend that we should use some sort of federation, which is nothing but you use an external third-party service or identity provider, which will create the user, and then you have to create, of course, the trust relationship. Now, the trust relationship will be between that identity provider and your AWS organization and AWS account. Once you set up that trust relationship, your usernames will be created in your identity provider, and then you can subsequently use those username inside the AWS for, of course, accessing the services again. What's good in that method, because your usernames are created externally into identity provider, when someone is trying to use that username to access your service, you won't be using your like username or access keys. When the authentication will set up, because it's again coming to trust relationship, now the principal will be that identity provider and username in that identity provider. You will be getting access to AWS resources using the roles which will be created temporarily. So instead of your username and password, which can have like uncontrollable session, you can log in and you can leave it running for whole day. Because you have IAM roles now, you can control in a better way. You can revoke the sessions in between if there is a compromise into the account. You can even control like what should be session timeout for a particular role which someone is getting as part of their single sign-on authentication using an external third-party federation account. And one of the service which AWS provide to make sure that this concept work is AWS IAM Identity Center. Now AWS IAM Identity Center, again we'll discuss about it in detail in the subsequent episode, but AWS Identity Center is kind of like a parallel service which is running on to AWS, which is managing all the users groups which have a direct trust relationship with your external identity providers, and which make sure that for every new user, they belong to a particular group or maybe a standalone user, a particular IAM role will be created whenever that user try to create a session. So AWS IAM Identity Center try to manage that part, and of course it support, like I mentioned, you have multiple accounts. It support creating custom access to each account, and it also help in assigning permission and policies from each individual account to that user group which is created as part of your identity provider, but is also reflected into Identity Center as part of trust relationship. So AWS IAM Identity Center, it was previously known as AWS Single Sign-On, which makes more sense, but I don't know why they changed the name. Maybe trying to make it again closer to IAM because it's related to IAM. So they changed it to AWS IAM Identity Center, and it's used for this whole concept of creating and managing identities. Amazon Cognito is a new service. It's new for me because personally I haven't used it, but what I understand in my brief reading about this whole while preparing for today's episode, Amazon Cognito is used when you are trying to create a web application and you want your users to authenticate themselves using identity providers like Google or Facebook. You can have this integration using Cognito. So what they'll be doing is they can it's as simple as when you sometimes try to log in into your website, sometimes you get this option like, do you want to authenticate from your Gmail account or do you want to authenticate from your Facebook? They give you this option these days. Everything like that is actually implemented using Cognito because it actually give you option of not only having like a particular identity provider which you as in your AWS organization is using. AWS Cognito give from the perspective of your application which is running onto the cloud, and how any user who is not having access to your AWS infrastructure or AWS user infrastructure, but they want to access the web application, so they can use their own Google or Facebook account to authenticate themselves into web application. Now again, the key point is web application. It's not yet talking about AWS resources. AWS Cognito does provide access to your AWS resources, but that's a completely different concept. That's kind of like an additional feature which AWS Cognito have, but most widely used feature is when you are trying to authenticate to a particular web application using your personal Google or Facebook account. You can do that using Amazon Cognito. So that's the whole point of using Amazon Cognito, and that's the whole concept around that. Long-term and temporary credential mechanism, which they talk about in the knowledge base as well. Long-term is nothing when you have like static username and password access keys. Short-term is nothing but your short-term tokens. Now, when we talk about short-term tokens, STS is the one service which help us in providing that tokens or those temporary credential. Now, STS is nothing but credentials or temporary tokens which you get when you assume a role. So for example, if I'm authenticating myself by my username and password, and then I'm further authenticating myself by assuming a particular role, so the secondary badge, if you remember, I will be getting some sort of maybe secret, a temporary secret. So for example, in the secondary badge case, when I'm trying to tap it onto a door, maybe I have to key in some temporary credential like 456, something like that. And those are temporary credential. They will be changed after 8 hours or after a particular day or particular time period. And then you will get another temporary credential or tokens. So those tokens will be getting using AWS STS service. Once you get that, you can like completely authenticate yourself and use your second badge freely. Means that's kind of like a second level authentication by assuming a role. So just think what AWS did there. Not only you have to assume the role, you have to also use some temporary credential to make sure you authenticate again using that role. And that's how you get the access to the resources which you ideally should not be having. So that's why it's like a security on top of security. And of course, it's controlled by time period as well. All right, I think from the basic level, this should be enough to kickstart our IAM discussion. We did cover some of the topics around username, roles, and different AWS services. I tried to briefly touch everything. I still haven't gone detail into everything, so of course we'll be going in much more detail from the authentication perspective in the next week episode. One thing to remember is authentication in itself is pretty limited because it's nothing but just getting yourself authenticated, like who you are. But the authorization bit is more complicated because then we deal with really policies, like real policies which are assigned to a particular user or role. How those policies are evaluated, is there any tool which we can use to simulate the policies, what's the criteria, like is there a policy which can implicitly or explicitly override another policy. So that's, I think, the more critical part from the identity and access management perspective. So in the next week episode, we will be covering authorization as well, like basics of authorization, and then we will try to plug in one by one each service, try to build our understanding around the whole identity and access management as a concept together. So by the time, like when we finish up this topic, we'll be having a good understanding of how users get authenticated and how they are authorized to use a particular service, which different services comes into picture around this discussion, and of course then we'll move toward infrastructure security. So that's all for domain 4 kickstarting, and let's catch up in next week episode with some more exciting topics around identity and access management. Goodbye and good luck.
Thanks for listening to this episode. Follow the show so you don't miss out, as we deliver piping hot topics every week.
If you're a podcast host, listen up, this one's for you. My name is Allie Jackson. I'm the host of Finding Mr. Height, a dating and relationship podcast that I've been doing for 4 years now, sharing my positive and practical approach to dating that's built on my own life experience. And I wanted to share another experience that I've had, my secret behind monetizing my show. It's called Red Circle, and I was just telling my colleague about how much I love their platform. With Red Circle, not only am I getting a seamless hosting experience, but I also love the support I receive in ad sales. It's not just typical ad sales either. It's targeted opportunities based on my show and my life. And the platform is super simple. You just set your preferences and Red Circle matches you with sponsors that align with your show. You can vet every opportunity and their platform gives you great analytics. More recently too, my Red Circle team has brought me opportunities outside of my podcast on social media to really augment the podcast partnerships, bring them full circle. I just can't recommend them enough. If you want to give it a try, go to redcircle.com to get your free trial. That's redcircle.com for a free trial.